Edit.
Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue on our journey on the discussion of non-chord tones. As you recall, non-chord tones, sometimes called embellishing tones or non-harmonic tones, are pitches that are classified by not belonging to the prevailing harmony of a measure. And the reason why we're talking about it is to A, understand that they exist, and B, know how to analyze a score and know what notes you need to incorporate into a Roman numeral analyses and which one of these you don't incorporate. In our previous video, we talked about passing tones, neighbor tones, and escape tones. If you didn't check that out, I recommend you do that first before we move on. If you have checked it out and you're ready to move on, let's dig in. So I want to start off this video with an example of an excerpt that's going to make use of a couple non-chord tones that will be unfamiliar faces to us. This is going to cover the appoggiatura, the anticipation, and we'll talk a little bit about how pedal point works. Remember that with all non-chord tones, we're interested in classifying the type of non-chord tone depending on how the non-chord tone, meaning the note outside the chord, is approached and how we leave it. Basically, how do we enter the dissonance and how do we exit the dissonance? So for starters, the appoggiatura, it doesn't just have a cool name. It is actually a very expressive, lovely example of the non-chord tone. This is a non-chord tone that is kind of the opposite of the escape tone. Instead of stepping to a non-chord tone and then resolving it by leaping to a chord tone, we are instead going to very dramatically leap to a non-chord tone and then resolve it by step. So we could leap up to an appoggiatura, that's a non-chord tone, and then resolve it. Or we could leap down to a non-chord tone and then resolve it by step as well. It's just always we resolve it by step in the opposite direction of the leap. So let's look at this example here. Similarly, we're going to analyze the harmonies that are at play. And it sounds like this. So we're in G major, and let's analyze some of these harmonies. The beginning gesture, starting on scale degree 5 and leaping up to 5, before we start doing these kind of like chromatically decorated arpeggios, I think that opening 5 gesture seems to be our dominant and then turns into the tonic once we give ourselves that first triad there in the left hand. So let's analyze these with that in mind. I'll say 5 for the first chord, followed by 1 for our downbeat of the next bar. A lot of these other notes are kind of confusing us, right? Where exactly is our triad? Looking at the left hand, you can kind of see a clearer outline of a triad. We see a nice triadic motion outlining G, B, D in the key of G. That's our 1. Then it repeats that in the upper octave. Then the next chord, we've got a G, C, E. That's like a C chord in second inversion. But notice it's a little complicated because now we have an A up in the soprano, so I'm going to include that A as part of this chord. So it would be, if I put A on the bottom and built it in triads, it would be A, C, E, and G. So that's an A minor triad. That's our 2 chord, a 2-7. But since we have that 7th, the chordal 7th, that G in the bass, I'll call this a 2-4-2, and that plays for the next bar as well. I'll point out that we have kind of a short example of what we'd call a pedal point. And a pedal point is another type of non-chord tone. A pedal is a note that's held through changing harmonies. It's going to start as a chord tone, and then we're going to move through a number of other harmonies while that tone is maintained. A lot of times in the bass voice of a changing texture of harmonies atop that chord. And we can go through a series of chords. We can go through several minutes of music with a pedal playing beneath that's either building tension or grounding all the sort of like sense of stasis upon which we have other chords moving. So do we incorporate this into the harmonic analysis? In this case, we have that G that's being maintained through the first 2 chords. It's doing something to give you a sense of tonic stasis building, but I'm going to incorporate it into the analysis here. I'll say that this is the 7th of that 2 chord. But if we get into longer examples where there is one tone that is grounding a series of chords on top and that bottom note doesn't seem to belong to the harmonies, we would go ahead and circle that and say that's a pedal point. In this case, let's factor this into the Roman numerals and just say this is the 7th chord in inversion. And then it seems like it gets a little bit more straightforward. We've got what appears to be a D harmony in bar 5. That's in first inversion. That's a 5-6. Back to a D triad again, the whole bar, back to root position 5. And then we go to an outline of a G, B, and D in the bass in bar 6. That's our 1 chord, followed by a C, E, and A. That's like an A minor first inversion triad. So let's call that 2-6. And then we will call this next one, that is a D, G, and C. Interesting. Who is this guy? Followed by D, A, and D with, say, a C in the soprano. So that would be like a D triad with a 7th in the bass. What is this combo? this fact of having like a 1 in inversion going to a 5 before we resolve to 1, that combo is actually what we call a cadential 6-4. The reason why we give it a special name, cadential 6-4, is that combination of what appears to be a do, ti, do in the soprano, and a kind of like 1 to 5 to 1, but 1 is destabilized by having it in second inversion. We kind of think of that instead as a 5 chord with a 4 to 3 suspension and a 6 to 5 suspension. We're about to talk about suspensions, so more context will come in just a few seconds, but just so you know, we'll be labeling a couple times when you see this scale degrees 5, 5, 1 in the bass with a do, ti, do action in one of the upper voices as a combination of a cadential 6-4 to 5 to a 1, and a lot of times it's going to result in a pack. So what are these other notes that are not part of these triads that we just talked about? So it appears that we are in the very first chord, leaping from so to so, and then having this chromatic action of A sharp to B and F sharp to G. What is the definition of its relationship to the triad? We kind of had leapt to a non-chord tone and then resolved it up in the opposite direction. We leapt again to a non-chord tone and resolved it up in the other direction. So those first two things, the first two non-chord tones, we'll circle them, and these are appoggiaturas. We leapt to a non-chord tone and resolve it in the opposite direction. And the second bar, the second full bar, has that same thing happening with we leapt to a non-chord tone and resolve them upwards. These are just like decorating the triads that we just labeled in the left hand. This only starts to expand our language a little bit when we leap up to that C and come down with the B. That's clearly just a passing motion that because the B is not in our two chord. Then we start getting into more just regular passing motion where we have a passing on that E in bar 5. You might notice that we're not circling that C in bar 5 as being a passing tone. Why not? Well, I'm thinking that this chord is actually a dominant 7 chord, and C is the dominant 7 of that 5 chord. So we're not going to list that as a non-chord tone. Notice what happens in the next bar, though. We keep that C, and that C is definitely not part of the next chord. So how do we define what's happening here? Whenever we have a note that is in a chord, that then the chord moves and that tone remains behind, resolving later by step, that's called a suspension that we just talked about earlier. So anytime we have a chord tone that is held over into the next chord, where the next chord moved and that chord tone that was previously consonant becomes dissonant before resolving eventually, is called a suspension. We like to specify the type of suspension based on what is its distance against our bass. So if we see that we're trying to have a G in the bass, a G triad, and that C is held over, that is a fourth above our G, compound fourth, but a fourth nonetheless, resolving to a third above the G. So I'd call this a 4-3 suspension. Now this last bit gets a little leapy and it gets a little scary. How do we determine what's a chord tone and not? So to help me out, I'm just going to look at the Roman numerals that we articulated earlier. So this is supposed to be a 1 chord on the downbeat of bar 6. So my 1 chord, if we're in the key of G, this should be a G triad. So we spotted already that the C was a suspension from before. The next chord is supposed to be a 2-7 chord in first inversion. 2 is an A minor chord, so A, C, E, and G, of which everything in this beat belongs to that triad, so nothing needs to get circled there. The one afterwards, the one we're calling a cadential 6-4, remember that cadential 6-4 is going to look like a 1-6-4. This is our G triad. So this should have all the chord tones that are in G, so G, B, and D. So we have a couple weird things going on in this beat, and this is where it gets a little thorny, so bear with me. That E that we start the bar out with, we're like, well, E is not part of a G triad chord, so what's this doing here? The fact that we notice that this came right beforehand in the previous bar, even though we rearticulate that note, it's not tied, but the fact of we're hearing it as part of the previous bar's harmony, we could consider this, again, another suspension where that E is being carried over from the previous bar. The only thing that's a little bit wacky is that this C in the left hand, C is not from the previous bar. It appears to be part of the next bar. That C is the chordal 7th of our dominant chord. So what do we call it when it seems like we're playing the next chord's tones before we've gotten to that chord yet? So whenever that happens, this is called a anticipation. So an anticipation, a lot of times you'll see someone resolving and giving a little bit of a flavor of the harmonies to come, a beat before or a note before that chord actually moves. So in this case, I will say that in this same bar, a lot is happening. On that same beat, we have the E being carried over from the previous bar. We've got the C anticipating the next harmony, where C is then articulated as part of the 5-7 chord before we resolve all these bad boys onto our tonic. So what the effect is that we have kind of a blurring harmonically of tones pushing and pulling to create these kinds of interweaving lines that drive us towards the cadence. So one of the nice things is that we can parse out something complicated like this once we've learned the vocabulary of what chord tones to be on the lookout for, to start to explain things that start acting weird. And something else that's helped us out in figuring out the Roman numerals here is kind of going back to the harmonic progressions and cadence types that we've studied already to date, to get a flow of what are their relationships from one chord to the next and how do they drive towards a cadence, in order for us to say, well, commonly I would expect a cadential 6/4 to 5/1 in a strong pack like this. And once I have a general framework in mind of harmonically how these chords should move, I start to understand which chord tones are acting a little bit mischievous. So that is how I feel more confident in being able to say, yes, you belong in the chord, and you are acting like a non-chord tone, and we can start to circle things accordingly. Hopefully you're starting to get the knack of how you identify non-chord tones and getting faster at our Roman numeral analyses. Notice that we've expanded our palette from passing, neighbor, and escape tones to include appoggiatura, anticipation, pedal point, and suspension. In our next video, we're going to include double neighbors and retardations, as well as cover some additional repertoire. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in our next video, the last one of our series of non-chord tones. See you there.